Racist cop punches and smash black woman's stall, but he didn't know biggest mistake of his life. In this gripping and eye-opening video, we delve into a shocking incident that highlights the ongoing issue of racism and police brutality. A disturbing encounter unfolds as a law enforcement officer, fueled by prejudice, unjustly targets a black woman, leading to a confrontation that reveals the ugly face of discrimination within the system. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
Every Sunday morning, the streets would transform into a bustling hub of life, filled with rows of colorful stalls. Among these vendors was Linda Brooks, a woman in her early 40s, known throughout the area not just for the quality of her produce, but also for her kindness and unyielding spirit. Linda's stall was always one of the busiest. She sold exotic fruits and vegetables, many of which she grew herself in the greenhouses she had worked tirelessly to build over the years. Her produce wasn't just food, it was a symbol of her hard work and dedication. Customers trusted her not only for the quality of what she sold, but also because of her integrity. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, whether they were buying a single apple or a whole basket of fruits. Over the years, Linda had built a loyal customer base, and her stall had become a cornerstone of the market. But success didn't come without challenges. In a community that still struggled with underlying racial tensions, Linda's thriving business often attracted unwelcome attention. There were always those who resented her success, believing that someone like her didn't deserve to be at the top. She had dealt with subtle forms of prejudice before: condescending remarks, attempts to undermine her stall, or whispered comments from other vendors. But Linda had learned to hold her head high, knowing that she had earned every bit of her success through hard work and resilience. That morning, as Linda carefully arranged baskets of vibrantly colored fruits on her stall, she couldn't shake off a strange feeling in the air. Something felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The market was as lively as ever, with customers milling about, bargaining and enjoying the atmosphere. Children ran between the stalls, giggling as they chased each other, while vendors called out to potential buyers, trying to lure them in with promises of the best deals. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but Linda's instincts told her otherwise. As she continued setting up her stall, a shadow fell over her produce. She looked up to see Officer Jack Thompson standing a few feet away, his eyes scanning her stall with a mix of disdain and suspicion. Thompson was well known in the area, and not for good reasons. He had a reputation for being aggressive and heavy-handed, especially when it came to dealing with minority communities. Though he was technically assigned to patrol the neighborhood, many residents felt more intimidated than protected by his presence. Thompson wasn't alone. Another officer stood a short distance behind him, looking somewhat uncomfortable but following his partner's lead nonetheless. It wasn't unusual for police officers to patrol the market, but something about Thompson's demeanor made it clear that this wasn't a routine visit. He wasn't just observing the scene, he was looking for trouble. Linda straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron as she prepared herself for whatever was about to come. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but there was something about Thompson's presence that made her uneasy. He wasn't just there to patrol, he had a purpose, and it didn't seem like a good one. "Morning," Officer Linda said, keeping her voice calm and neutral. She had learned long ago that it was better to remain composed in situations like these. Showing any sign of fear or anger would only escalate things. "Can I help you with something?" Thompson didn't respond immediately. He took a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the pavement as he loomed over her stall. He seemed to be assessing her, trying to decide how far he could push her before she reacted. Finally, he spoke, his tone cold and authoritative. You got a permit for this stall?" Linda resisted the urge to sigh. She had been running this stall for years, and her permit was always up to date. But she knew that Thompson wasn't really interested in whether or not she had a permit. This was about something else: power, control, and perhaps even resentment. "Yes, officer," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I have all the necessary permits. Would you like to see them?" Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was disappointed by her lack of reaction. He had likely expected her to get defensive or flustered, but Linda wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she calmly reached into the drawer beneath her stall and pulled out a folder containing her documents. She handed them to Thompson, who took them without a word. For a few moments there was silence as Thompson pretended to study the papers. Linda could see from the way his eyes flicked across the pages that he wasn't really reading them. He was stalling, trying to come up with another reason to cause trouble. When he finally handed the documents back, his expression remained cold. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He didn't sound pleased by this fact. "But I've had some complaints about your stall. People say you're taking up too much space and causing a disturbance." Linda raised an eyebrow. This was a new one. No one had ever complained about her stall before, at least not directly. Most of the other vendors were on friendly terms with her, and her customers never caused any issues. She suspected that Thompson had made up the complaint as an excuse to harass her. "I haven't heard any complaints," she said carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "But if there's an issue, I'd be happy to discuss it with the market manager. I'm sure we can resolve it without any trouble." Thompson's jaw tightened slightly, a clear sign that he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. He wasn't interested in resolving anything peacefully. He wanted to assert his authority and make a scene. Before Linda could say anything else, he reached out and knocked over one of the baskets of fruits, sending bright oranges and red apples rolling across the ground. A few gasps came from nearby customers who had been watching the exchange. Linda felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. Reacting emotionally would only give Thompson more ammunition to use against her. "I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and leave," Thompson said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This market doesn't need disturbances like this." Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to back down, but she also knew that she needed to handle this carefully. One wrong move, and things could spiral out of control. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, waiting to see how she would respond. "I'm not causing a disturbance, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm just here to sell my produce, like I do every week. If you have a legitimate reason for asking me to leave, I'd like to hear it." For a moment there was a standoff. Thompson glared at her, clearly frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated. Around them, the market seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense silence. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The tension around the market intensified as Officer Jack Thompson squared his shoulders, his eyes burning with barely contained hostility. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone like Linda Brooks, an independent black woman who didn't flinch under his authority. In his mind, the market was his territory, a place where he could walk in and instantly command obedience. People usually complied without question when he barked orders, too afraid of the consequences to stand up to him. But Linda was different. She wasn't raising her voice, she wasn't backing down, and she wasn't giving him the satisfaction of showing fear. Thompson didn't come here by accident that day. He had been simmering with resentment for weeks after hearing complaints mostly from other vendors about how popular Linda's stall had become. Though these complaints had no official basis, they had given him all the excuse he needed to act. He saw Linda's success not as a testament to her hard work, but as something undeserved, something that rubbed him the wrong way. In his mind, she was just another person who didn't belong in a place of prominence, someone who needed to be reminded of her place. The crowd that had been watching the confrontation began to grow. Some murmured quietly among themselves, while others stood in tense silence, unsure of what would happen next. Despite the growing audience, Thompson felt no pressure to de-escalate. If anything, he welcomed the attention. It gave him the chance to assert his authority in front of everyone and send a clear message: defy me, and there will be consequences. He took a step closer to Linda's stall, deliberately invading her space. His imposing figure loomed over the small wooden counter where her remaining fruits and vegetables were displayed. Without waiting for a response to his previous order, he reached out and knocked over another basket this time, one filled with delicate, carefully arranged exotic fruits. The bright yellow and green produce scattered across the ground, some of it splitting open on impact, the sweet scent of the crushed fruit wafting into the air. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly, shocked by the blatant aggression. Linda's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. It took every ounce of self-control she had not to react impulsively. She knew exactly what Thompson was trying to do: provoke her into an emotional outburst so he could justify further action. But Linda wasn't about to give him that. She had dealt with far too many instances of unwarranted hostility in her life to be goaded into a trap by someone like him. "Officer," she said, her voice measured and calm, though the tension was clear beneath the surface. There was no need for that. "I'm here legally. My permits are valid. You've seen them yourself. I've done nothing wrong." Thompson's lip curled into a sneer, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He wasn't interested in legalities. He wasn't interested in fairness. This was about power, pure and simple, and Linda's refusal to bend to his will only made him more determined to break her. He crossed his arms, making a show of looking around at the gathered crowd, as though daring anyone else to speak up. "I told you to pack up and leave," he said, his tone low but menacing. "If you don't, I'll have to take further action. Last warning." Linda didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she bent down slowly, picked up one of the fallen fruits from the ground, and set it gently back on the counter. Her movements were deliberate, as if to show Thompson that no matter how much he tried to intimidate her, she wasn't going anywhere. "Further action," she repeated, straightening up and meeting his gaze head-on. "What exactly do you mean by that, officer? I'm following all the rules. I've got nothing to hide. So, unless you have a legitimate reason to shut down my stall, I suggest you stop harassing me." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Everyone knew that standing up to a cop, especially one like Thompson, was a risky move. But there was something about the way Linda carried herself, something about the quiet strength in her voice, that made it impossible for anyone to look away. It was as though she was drawing a line in the sand, daring Thompson to cross it. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, locked in a battle of wills. Thompson's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He wasn't used to being defied so openly, especially not in front of an audience. His pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to let Linda walk away without making her pay for it. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed the edge of the counter, flipping it over in one swift motion. The wooden surface crashed to the ground, sending the remaining fruits and vegetables scattering across the pavement. Several people in the crowd shouted in alarm, and a few even stepped forward, as if to intervene, but they hesitated, unsure of what to do. The market had descended into chaos in an instant. Linda stumbled back, barely keeping her balance as the counter fell. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let the fear show on her face. She had been through worse than this before. She wasn't going to let Thompson see her falter. enough a voice suddenly called out from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man pushing his way through the onlookers. He wore a neatly pressed suit, and though he didn't carry a badge, there was an air of authority about him that was impossible to ignore. He moved with purpose, his eyes locked on Thompson. The officer scowled as the man approached, clearly displeased by the interruption. "This is none of your business," Thompson snapped, his voice brimming with irritation. "Move along." The man didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed even more resolute. "It is my business," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm James Carter, legal advisor for the City Council. I oversee vendor permits for this market, and I can assure you that MS. Brooks is operating her stall fully within the law. You, on the other hand, are exceeding your authority." Thompson's face darkened, his expression twisting with anger. He opened his mouth to argue, but James held up a hand, cutting him off before he could speak. "If you continue this course of action..." James continued, "I will have no choice but to report your conduct to the mayor's office. I trust you understand the implications of that." A murmur swept through the crowd. Everyone knew that the mayor, Claudia Reynolds, was a staunch advocate for fairness and equality. She had worked tirelessly to improve relations between the police and the community, and she wouldn't take kindly to hearing about one of her officers abusing their power. Thompson's grip on his authority was slipping, and he knew it. His mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation without losing face. But before he could come up with a response, James took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Now, I suggest you step aside and let MS. Brooks continue her business. Or would you prefer to have this incident escalate further?" For a moment, it seemed as though Thompson might push back. His pride was wounded, and he hated the thought of backing down in front of so many people. But he also knew that James wasn't bluffing. If the mayor got involved, there would be serious consequences. With a frustrated grunt, Thompson took a step back, his fists still clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving the market in tense silence. Linda exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She glanced at James, offering him a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." James smiled faintly, though his expression remained serious. "It's not over yet," he said, echoing Thompson's words. "Be careful, Linda. He's not the type to let things go easily." As the crowd began to disperse and the market slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Thompson had been humiliated in front of everyone, and men like him didn't take kindly to that. She knew that there would be more trouble ahead, but for now, she was just grateful to have someone like James on her side. The tension in the market didn't dissipate even after Officer Thompson turned and walked away. Though it seemed as if the situation had calmed down, Linda knew better. She knew men like Thompson didn't just walk away from situations where their authority had been questioned, especially in front of a crowd. It was a temporary retreat, nothing more. Around her, the other vendors began to quietly return to their business, though many threw nervous glances in her direction, still shaken by the earlier confrontation. A few customers approached Linda's stall to offer their support, but most kept their distance, wary of drawing unwanted attention from the police. Linda bent down to pick up the scattered fruits and vegetables that Thompson had thrown to the ground. Some of them were too bruised or crushed to be salvaged, but she gathered what she could, placing the intact items back on the stall and discarding the rest. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was racing. She was angrier than she had been in a long time. Not just because of the damage Thompson had caused, but because of the sheer arrogance with which he had acted. He had come here with no legitimate reason, disrupted her business, and humiliated her in front of everyone, all because he thought he could. James Carter, the legal advisor who had intervened on her behalf, stood nearby, watching the scene with a concerned expression. "Linda," he said quietly, stepping closer, "are you okay?" She straightened up, brushing dirt off her hands. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was tense. "Thank you for stepping in. I don't know what he would have done if you hadn't been here." James nodded, but his expression remained serious. "You know he's not going to let this go, right? Guys like Thompson don't take well to being challenged, especially in public." Linda met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "I know, but what am I supposed to do? Let him push me around? Let him ruin my business? I've worked too hard to get to where I am. I'm not going to just roll over because some cop thinks he can throw his weight around." James sighed. "I get it, I do. Just be careful, okay? He's got the power to make your life difficult, and he won't hesitate to use it if he gets the chance." Linda appreciated James's concern, but she wasn't about to back down. She had faced adversity before: racism, prejudice, unfair treatment, and she had always stood her ground. This time wouldn't be any different. Still, she couldn't deny that the encounter with Thompson had shaken her. It wasn't just the loss of produce or the disruption to her business, it was the feeling of being targeted, of being singled out for no reason other than the fact that she was a successful black woman in a place where some people still didn't believe she belonged. As the day went on, Linda tried to put the incident behind her and focus on her customers. But the uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach remained. Every time she looked up and saw a police officer patrolling the market, her heart skipped a beat, even though none of them were Thompson. She hated that he had gotten under her skin like this, hated the way he had made her feel vulnerable in a place where she had always felt at home. By mid-afternoon, the market was beginning to wind down. Some vendors had already packed up and left, while others were in the process of doing so. Linda decided to stay a little longer, hoping to sell the rest of her produce before calling it a day. She was in the middle of helping a customer when she saw a familiar figure approaching from the corner of her eye. Her stomach clenched as she recognized Thompson, now accompanied by 2 other officers. Unlike before, there was no crowd around her stall to witness what was about to happen. Most people had already left, and those who remained were too far away to intervene. "Here we go again," Linda muttered under her breath, bracing herself for another confrontation. Thompson walked up to her stall with the same swagger as before, his expression cold and calculating. The 2 officers with him, one male, one female, stood a few steps behind, their faces carefully neutral. Linda couldn't tell whether they were here because they supported Thompson or because they felt obligated to follow his lead. Either way, their presence made her uneasy. "MS. Brooks," Thompson said, his tone deceptively polite. "I hope you're having a better day than earlier." Linda crossed her arms over her chest, refusing to be intimidated. "What do you want, officer?" Thompson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just doing a follow-up. You know, making sure everything's in order. After all, we wouldn't want any more disturbances, would we?" Linda's patience was wearing thin. She had tried to remain calm during their earlier encounter, but she wasn't in the mood for more of his games. "Everything is in order, just like it was this morning. You saw the permits yourself, so unless you have a valid reason to be here, I'd appreciate it if you left me to finish my day in peace." Thompson's expression hardened. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "You've got quite an attitude, MS. Brooks. Maybe you should learn a little respect when dealing with law enforcement." Linda didn't back down. Respect is earned, officer. And so far you haven't done much to earn mine. The tension between them was palpable. The two officers behind Thompson exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. It was clear that they didn't fully agree with their partner's approach, but neither of them was willing to challenge him. For a moment it seemed as if Thompson might escalate things further. His hand twitched slightly, as if he was considering reaching for his baton or his handcuffs. But before he could make a move, James Carter reappeared, walking briskly toward them with a determined look on his face. "Officer Thompson," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a reason you're harassing MS? Brooks again? Because if there isn't, I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself." Thompson turned to face James, his expression darkening. "This doesn't concern you, Carter. Stay out of it." "It concerns me when a member of my community is being targeted without cause," James replied. "You've already been warned once. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can get away with this." For a moment, it looked like Thompson might push back, but then he seemed to reconsider. Maybe he realized that he was outnumbered, or maybe he simply didn't want to risk another public scene. Either way, he took a step back, his jaw clenched in frustration. "This isn't over," he muttered, glaring at Linda one last time before turning on his heel and walking away. The two officers followed him, their expressions unreadable. Linda exhaled slowly, the tension in her body finally beginning to ease. "Thanks again, James. I owe you one." "You don't owe me anything," James said. "Just be careful, okay? Thompson's not the type to let things go easily." Linda nodded, though she couldn't help but wonder how much worse things might get before they got better. She had a feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the market, Linda tried to push away the lingering tension that clung to her after the second encounter with Officer Thompson. Her hands moved mechanically as she sorted the remaining produce on her stall, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Though Thompson had left for the moment, she knew deep down that he wasn't finished. Men like him didn't just walk away and forget, especially not after being publicly challenged twice in one day. Still, there was little she could do now except remain vigilant and finish what was left of her work. The market had thinned out considerably. Most of the other vendors had packed up their stalls and headed home, leaving only a few stragglers who were either finishing their sales or chatting with the remaining customers. The usual lively energy of the market had faded, replaced by a quiet calm as the day drew to a close. Linda considered wrapping up early, but something held her back. She didn't want to give Thompson the satisfaction of thinking he had intimidated her into leaving before she was ready. If she was going to close up, it would be on her terms, not his. As she continued arranging the last of her goods, she heard approaching footsteps and glanced up to see James Carter walking toward her once again. His expression was serious, as it had been earlier, but now there was a hint of something else in his eyes: concern, perhaps, or maybe even frustration. "Still here." "Ha," he said as he stopped in front of her stall, folding his arms across his chest. "I figured you might have called it a day after what happened earlier." Linda gave him a weary smile. "I thought about it. But if I leave early, that means he wins, doesn't it? And I'm not about to let that happen." James nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "I get it. But you need to be careful, Linda. Thompson's the kind of guy who holds a grudge. You embarrassed him twice today, and people like him don't forget things like that easily." "I know," Linda said with a sigh, leaning against the wooden counter of her stall. "Believe me, I know. But what am I supposed to do? Give up my stall, stop coming to the market, and just let him push me out. That's exactly what he wants. And if I give in now, what's to stop him from doing the same thing to someone else next week? James was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. You're right, he said finally. Standing your ground is important. But there's a difference between being brave and being reckless. Thompson's got power, and if he decides to come after you again, he might not stop at just harassing you. He could escalate things, and you could end up getting hurt. Linda knew James meant well, but his words only reinforced the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her all day. She appreciated his concern, but she wasn't about to let fear dictate her actions. She had dealt with adversity her whole life. This was just another challenge to overcome. I'll be careful, she said after a pause. But I'm not running away from this. I've worked too hard to build this business. I'm not going to let one bad cop ruin everything. James didn't argue. He knew Linda well enough to know that once she made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. Just in case, he said, if anything happens, call me. Day or night, doesn't matter. I'll be there. Linda took the card with a grateful nod. Thanks, James. I appreciate it. With that, James turned and walked away, leaving Linda alone once more. She slipped the card into her pocket and returned to her work, trying to shake off the lingering sense of foreboding. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the task at hand, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something bad was coming. Her instincts were proven right, not even half an hour later. She was just beginning to pack up her stall when she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots approaching. Her heart sank as she turned to see Thompson once again, this time accompanied by 3 other officers. Unlike earlier, when he had tried to maintain a veneer of professionalism, Thompson's expression now was one of open hostility. It was clear that he had come back with a purpose, and it wasn't to check her permits. MS. Brooks, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he came to a stop in front of her stall. Fancy seeing you still here. I thought I told you to pack up and leave. Linda straightened up, forcing herself to remain calm. You told me to leave without cause, officer. I have every right to be here, and you know it. Thompson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it looked as though he might explode. But instead, he smiled a cold, predatory smile that sent a chill down Linda's spine. Right or not, he said, you're causing a disturbance. And as far as I'm concerned, that's enough reason for me to shut you down. Before Linda could respond, Thompson reached out and grabbed the edge of her stall, pulling it over with a single violent motion. The wooden structure collapsed in an instant, sending fruits and vegetables spilling across the pavement. Several crates toppled over, their contents scattering in every direction. Linda stumbled back in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. Around her, a few remaining vendors and customers gasped in disbelief, but no one dared to intervene. The officers who had accompanied Thompson stood by silently, their expressions unreadable. What the hell are you doing? Linda demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You can't do that. This is my livelihood. Thompson didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he was standing uncomfortably close. You're resisting a lawful order, MS. Brooks, he said quietly, his tone menacing. That's grounds for arrest. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she realized just how far Thompson was willing to go. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her anymore, he was trying to provoke her into doing something he could use against her. He wanted her to fight back, to give him an excuse to escalate things further. But Linda wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. I'm not resisting anything, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. I'm standing here, unarmed and peaceful. You're the one escalating things, officer." Thompson's smile faltered slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to remain so composed. For a moment it seemed as though he might back down, but then, out of the corner of her eye, Linda saw him reach for something on his belt. Before she could react, James Carter appeared once again, this time accompanied by 2 uniformed officers from the local precinct. "That's enough," Thompson James said loudly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Stand down." Thompson turned, his expression one of barely contained rage. "What are you doing here, Carter? This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when a member of my community is being harassed without cause," James replied. "And it concerns me when an officer of the law oversteps his bounds. These officers are here to make sure you don't cross the line any further." For a moment, it looked as though Thompson might push back. His hand hovered near his belt, and his jaw clenched tightly. But eventually he seemed to realize that he was outnumbered, and that any further action on his part would only make things worse. "This isn't over," he muttered through gritted teeth, glaring at Linda one last time before turning on his heel and stalking away. The officers who had accompanied him followed reluctantly, their expressions betraying a mix of discomfort and unease. As the tension finally began to dissipate, Linda exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline wore off. James approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Linda nodded, though she still felt shaken. "Yeah," she said. "Thanks for stepping in again," anytime James replied. "But this isn't over. Thompson's not going to let this go, and you need to be prepared." Linda knew he was right. The day's events had been a clear warning. Thompson wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and if she wanted to protect her business and herself, she was going to have to fight back, harder than ever before. The following morning brought no sense of peace for Linda. She had spent most of the previous night tossing and turning, unable to shake the events of the day before. The image of Officer Thompson's smug, hostile face loomed large in her mind, and every time she closed her eyes, she could see the violent way he had overturned her stall, hear the cruel satisfaction in his voice when he accused her of resisting. Though James and the other officers had eventually diffused the situation, Linda knew that the encounter had been far from resolved. Thompson wasn't the type to back down after being publicly humiliated, and she feared that it was only a matter of time before he made another move. Still, she wasn't one to give in to fear. She had lived her whole life fighting against obstacles, and this would be no different. After all, what choice did she have? If she let Thompson scare her away from the market, everything she had worked for would be lost. That thought alone was enough to propel her forward, despite the unease that gnawed at her. By mid-morning she was back at the market, setting up her stall with practiced efficiency. Though some of her produce had been damaged beyond repair in the previous day's incident, she still had enough to put together a respectable display. A few of the other vendors approached her cautiously, offering murmured words of support and encouragement. Most of them had seen what had happened, but none had dared to intervene. Linda didn't blame them. She understood the fear that came with standing up to someone in power, especially when that someone wore a badge. Despite the quiet tension in the air, the market soon came to life once more, bustling with activity as customers wandered through the rows of stalls, bargaining for fresh produce and handmade goods. Linda focused on her work, greeting her regulars with a warm smile and doing her best to put the previous day's events out of her mind. But the peace didn't last long. It started subtly, a few unfamiliar faces lingering near her stall, watching her with a little too much interest. At first, Linda tried to ignore them, assuming they were just curious customers. But as the morning wore on, their presence became harder to dismiss. They didn't approach her to buy anything, nor did they seem interested in any of the other stalls. Instead, they loitered nearby, their eyes following her every move. She felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right. Her suspicion was confirmed when she caught sight of Officer Thompson standing at the far end of the market, leaning casually against a lamppost. He wasn't alone this time. 2 more officers stood beside him, their postures relaxed but their eyes sharp. They weren't here for a routine patrol, they were here for her. Linda's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to show fear, not now. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to her stall, determined to continue as if nothing was wrong. If Thompson wanted to intimidate her, he would have to try harder than this. But Thompson wasn't interested in subtle intimidation today. A few minutes later, he began making his way toward her stall, the other officers trailing behind him. As he approached, the crowd around her seemed to sense the impending confrontation, parting instinctively to give them space. The lively hum of the market quieted, tension hanging heavy in the air. "Good morning, MS," Brooks Thompson said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I see you're back at it again. Guess yesterday's little incident didn't teach you much." Linda straightened up, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm here legally, officer. You know that. If you have a legitimate reason to be here, say it. Otherwise, leave me alone and let me do my job." A flicker of annoyance crossed Thompson's face, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "Oh, I've got a reason. All right," he said. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity around this market. Thought we'd swing by and make sure everything's in order." Linda clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to argue. She knew better than to rise to his bait. Instead, she reached for her permits, ready to show them once again. But Thompson wasn't interested in her permits. Before she could hand them over, he gestured to the officers behind him. "Check the stall," he ordered. The 2 officers hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the command. But under Thompson's watchful eye, they had little choice. Stepping forward, they began rifling through Linda's produce, overturning crates and digging through boxes without care. Customers who had been browsing moments earlier backed away, watching in shocked silence as the officers tore through her stall. Linda's hands trembled with anger, but she forced herself to remain still. This was exactly what Thompson wanted to provoke her, to make her lose control so he could justify further action. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "You have no right to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fury that burned in her chest. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're harassing me, and everyone here can see it." Thompson chuckled, crossing his arms over his chest. "Harassment? No, MS Brooks. This is just routine procedure. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." One of the officers hesitated as he reached for a crate at the back of the stall. "It's clean," sir, he said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Thompson's smile tightened. He hadn't expected them to find anything. This was never about enforcing the law. It was about sending a message. Well, he said, stepping closer. "Looks like you're lucky today, MS Brooks. But don't get too comfortable. We'll be keeping a close eye on you." Before Linda could respond, a familiar voice rang out behind her. "That's enough." She turned to see James Carter approaching once again, this time accompanied by a small group of people, community leaders, vendors, and even a few off-duty officers who had heard about the previous day's incident. Their presence lent weight to his words, and for the first time, Thompson looked genuinely uneasy. "You've crossed the line," Thompson James said, his tone cold. "This isn't law enforcement. This is harassment, plain and simple, and it ends now." Thompson bristled, his hand twitching slightly as if he was considering reaching for his baton. But he didn't move. He knew he was outnumbered, and any further action would only make him look worse. "You're making a mistake, Carter," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know who you're dealing with." James didn't flinch. "Neither do you." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. But eventually Thompson seemed to realize that he had lost this round. With a final glare at Linda, he turned on his heel and stalked away, the other officers following reluctantly behind him. As the crowd began to disperse, Linda exhaled slowly, the weight of the confrontation finally lifting from her shoulders. James stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I will be," she replied. "Thanks again, James. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You're not alone, Linda," he said firmly. "We've got your back, and we're not going to let Thompson get away with this." Linda nodded, grateful for his support. But even as she began to clean up the mess left behind by the officers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Thompson had made it clear that he wasn't going to back down, and if she wanted to protect herself and her business, she would have to be ready for whatever came next. As dusk settled over the city and shadows stretched long across the streets, Linda stood outside her modest home, staring at the quiet neighborhood that had always been her refuge. But tonight, even the familiar sights and sounds of her surroundings couldn't calm the storm inside her. The confrontation at the market earlier that day had left her more shaken than she was willing to admit. Though she had stood her ground and James had come to her aid once again, the reality of her situation was undeniable. Officer Thompson wasn't finished with her, not by a long shot. She could still see the venom in his eyes as he walked away, could still hear the barely concealed threat in his voice when he warned her that this wasn't over. He had been humiliated twice now, once in front of a crowd of onlookers, and again in front of James and the group of community leaders who had arrived to support her. Men like Thompson didn't take well to being embarrassed, especially by someone they saw as beneath them. And Linda knew he wouldn't rest until he had regained the upper hand. Despite the tension, she wasn't about to let fear dictate her actions. She had fought too hard for too long to be intimidated now. She had built her business from the ground up, earning the respect of her community through hard work and honesty. She wasn't going to let one man's ego and prejudice tear down everything she had worked for. The sound of an approaching car broke her train of thought, and she turned to see James pulling up to the curb. He stepped out of the vehicle, his expression grim but determined. As he walked toward her, Linda could see that he was carrying a folder under his arm, a folder that she guessed contained information about Thompson. "Evening, Linda," he said as he reached her. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" Linda gestured toward the porch, and they both took a seat on the worn wooden steps. For a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the neighborhood filling the silence. Finally, James opened the folder and pulled out a few sheets of paper, handing them to Linda. "I did some digging," he said. "Thompson's got a history. Multiple complaints filed against him over the years: excessive force, harassment, racial profiling. But none of them ever went anywhere. Looks like he's got friends in high places who've been covering for him." Linda scanned the documents, her anger growing with each line she read. "So he's been getting away with this for years," she muttered. "And now he thinks he can do the same to me." James nodded. "But this time it's different. You've got the community behind you. People are talking about what happened. If we push hard enough, we can get an official investigation started. But we need to be smart about it. Thompson's not going to go down without a fight." Linda set the papers aside, her mind racing. She knew James was right. Thompson wouldn't give up easily. He had already shown how far he was willing to go to silence her. But if she didn't stand up to him, who would? And how many more people would he go after if he thought he could get away with it? "I'm in," she said finally. Whatever it takes, I'm not backing down. He needs to be held accountable. James gave her a small, approving nod. Good. I've already reached out to a few people, journalists, civil rights groups. They're interested in your story. If we can get enough attention on this, it'll be harder for the department to sweep it under the rug. Linda appreciated James's efforts, but she knew that going public came with risks. Thompson wouldn't just sit back and let his reputation be destroyed without a fight. He would push back, and things could get ugly. Still, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let fear silence her. Let's do it, she said firmly. But we need to be prepared. If Thompson tries to come after me again, we need evidence, something they can't ignore or dismiss. James smiled faintly. Already ahead of you. I've got a few people keeping an eye on things. If he makes a move, we'll know about it. As they continued to discuss their plan, a sense of determination began to replace the fear and uncertainty that had plagued Linda all day. She wasn't alone in this fight. With James and the community behind her, she had a real chance of standing up to Thompson and making a difference. But even as they spoke, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that Thompson wouldn't wait long before making his next move. And she was right. The next morning, just as the market was beginning to come alive, Linda arrived to find her stall already surrounded by police tape. Thompson was there, of course, flanked by several officers who looked just as uncomfortable as they had the day before. But this time there was no pretense of politeness. Thompson's expression was cold and triumphant, as if he had already won. MS. Brooks, he said as she approached, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I'm afraid your stall is being shut down pending an investigation. We've received reports of illegal activity, and until we can determine the truth, we can't allow you to continue operating. Linda's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. What kind of illegal activity, she demanded. You know this is bogus, Thompson. You're just trying to shut me down because I stood up to you. Thompson's smile didn't waver. I'm just doing my job, MS Brooks. If you have a problem with it, you can take it up with the department. Before Linda could respond, James arrived, accompanied by several community leaders and a handful of local reporters. The sudden appearance of cameras seemed to rattle the other officers, but Thompson remained unfazed. This is harassment, James said loudly, stepping forward. You've got no legitimate reason to shut down this stall, and everyone here knows it. Thompson's eyes narrowed. Stay out of this, Carter. You're not helping her case. I'm here as a witness, James shot back. And so are they, he gestured toward the reporters, who had begun recording the scene. Whatever you do here today will be on record. So go ahead, keep digging your own grave. For a moment, it seemed as if Thompson might back down. The presence of the media had clearly thrown him off balance, and even the officers standing behind him looked uncertain. But Thompson wasn't one to admit defeat so easily. You want a show? Fine, he said, stepping closer to Linda. But don't think this is over. You can play your little games, but I'll be watching. And next time, you might not have your friends around to save you. With that, he turned and walked away, the other officers following reluctantly behind him. The reporters quickly gathered around Linda, bombarding her with questions. But all she could think about was Thompson's parting words. He wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. As James and the others helped her remove the police tape from her stall, Linda realized that the fight was far from over. But for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Thompson could threaten her all he wanted, but she wasn't alone in this battle. And with the support of her community, she knew that she had a real chance of standing up to him and winning. The climax wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something bigger. A fight for justice, a fight for her dignity, and a fight to show people like Thompson that their time was up. And Linda Brooks was ready for it. By the following day, word of the incident at the market had spread like wildfire. The local news stations had picked up the story, and video clips of Thompson's confrontation with Linda were circulating widely. The community groups rallied in support of Linda, calling for an official investigation into Thompson's actions and demanding accountability from the police department. The market, usually a bustling hub of commerce and camaraderie, was now a center of tension. Vendors whispered among themselves, customers hesitated before approaching, and the once lively atmosphere had turned heavy with unease. Linda had expected things to escalate, but even she hadn't anticipated how quickly the situation would spiral. She had barely finished setting up her stall that morning when James arrived, looking more serious than ever. Without a word, he handed her a newspaper. The headline read, "Vendor harassed by Officer Sparks, outrage community demands justice." Beneath it was a photo of Thompson standing in front of Linda's stall, flanked by his officers and surrounded by police tape. "They're paying attention now," James said quietly. "But that means things are going to get more intense. Thompson isn't going to take this lying down." Linda nodded, setting the newspaper aside. "Let him do what he wants. I'm not backing down." James gave her a measured look. "There's something else. The mayor's office reached out this morning. Mayor Reynolds wants to meet with you. She's taking this seriously." The news gave Linda a moment's pause. She had met Mayor Claudia Reynolds a few times before, mostly at community events where the mayor had made a point of supporting local businesses. Reynolds had a reputation for being fair and progressive, someone who genuinely cared about the people she represented. If she was getting involved, it meant there was a real chance of change. When Linda asked, "Good." "Later this afternoon," James replied. "She wants to talk to you in person, get your side of the story before making a public statement." Linda agreed without hesitation. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for, a chance to take the fight to the next level, to ensure that what had happened wouldn't just be swept under the rug. But even as she prepared herself for the meeting, a part of her couldn't help but worry. Thompson wasn't the type to sit back and watch as his power slipped away. He would push back, and she needed to be ready. A few hours later, Linda found herself standing outside City Hall, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to walk inside. James was by her side, his presence a steadying force. Together, they climbed the stone steps and entered the building, where they were greeted by one of the mayor's aides, a young woman with a kind smile and a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. "Ms. Brooks, Mr. Carter, thank you for coming," the aide said. "The mayor is waiting for you in her office, right this way." They followed her through a series of hallways until they reached a large wooden door with a brass plaque that read Mayor Claudia Reynolds. The aide knocked once, then opened the door, ushering them inside. The mayor rose from behind her desk as they entered, extending a hand in greeting. She was a tall woman with a commanding presence, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite the seriousness of the situation, her expression was warm and welcoming. "Linda, James, thank you for coming on such short notice," she said as they shook hands. "Please, have a seat." They sat down across from her, and the mayor wasted no time getting to the point. "I've reviewed the reports and seen the footage from the market. What happened to you, Linda, is unacceptable. No one should have to endure that kind of harassment, especially from someone who is supposed to protect and serve the community." Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her at the mayor's words. For the first time in days, it felt like someone in a position of power was truly listening to her. She took a deep breath and began recounting everything that had happened, from Thompson's initial confrontation to the destruction of her stall and his continued threats. Mayor Reynolds listened intently, occasionally taking notes but never interrupting. When Linda finished, the mayor leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Thompson," she said finally. "But until now, nothing has stuck. He's been protected by the system by people who don't want to acknowledge that there's a problem. That ends today." Linda exchanged a glance with James, hope flickering in her chest. "What happens now?" she asked. "The first step is to launch an official investigation," Reynolds replied. "I've already spoken with the police chief, and he's agreed to cooperate. Thompson will be placed on administrative leave while we conduct a thorough review of his actions. If we find evidence of misconduct, and from what I've seen so far, I believe he will face disciplinary action, up to and including termination." It was more than Linda had dared to hope for. But the mayor wasn't finished. "In addition," Reynolds continued, "I'm establishing a task force to review policies on police conduct and accountability. This task force will include members of the community, including business owners like yourself. Linda, I would like you to be a part of it." Linda blinked in surprise. "Me? You have first-hand experience with what needs to change," the mayor said. "Your voice matters. If you're willing, I believe you could make a real difference." For a moment, Linda didn't know what to say. She had come here hoping for justice, but she hadn't expected to be offered a seat at the table where real change could happen. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her, but it was a good kind of weight, the kind that came with knowing that her fight hadn't been in vain. "I'd be honored," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. The mayor smiled. "Good. I'll have my office contact you with the details. In the meantime, if there's anything you need, anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." As they left City Hall, Linda felt lighter than she had in days.